So if anything, frankly, my study of this gave me even a greater confidence in its reliability. But I think what can often happen is that anti-supernatural biases can sometimes invade us and therefore cause us to make, in my view, some really unwarranted claims based upon evidence that's not really there. Yes, there are variant readings, but again, they're of a tiny nature and such that really they are caused, we know, by auditory errors, faulty writing, faulty memory, and judgment. They had scriptoria, and they would one person would read from the lectionary, from the text itself rather, and he would read the text, and the scribes would be writing it down. And so sometimes there could be errors in hearing, or sometimes ditography could happen. You ever do this where you write at the end of the line, you type in the, and then there's another the right after it? Ever do this, or am I the only one? You know, you put the same word twice. Now it's immediately be underlined in red. I mean, all this has changed. The rules have changed, you see, before. But at any rate, that's called ditography, common error. And there are various examples of this sort of a thing. And so I could come up with examples of that, and it's often very easy to determine which reading best accounts for the others. Last thought on this. Small number, then, as I say, affect the sense of the passage, and really we're only dealing with a tiny percentage of that. And again, none of these really affect the actual meaning or theology of the New Testament at all. We'll stop here and pick up with a bibliographic test in terms of time span after our break. And then we're going to have some questions later, or we're going to do it tomorrow, Tom?
Later this evening.
Okay. Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to go to 9:15, and then we're going to have a little Q&A time. So a little interaction, so be thinking about what specific questions you might have. We can explore together and think those things through. Obviously, as I say, I'm only scratching the surface of a huge issue, and there are obviously a lot more nuanced components to this, but I'm giving you a broad brush perspective that I have found to be very useful in most of the encounters I have had. The third of the aspects of what I call the bibliographic test, the first was the manuscript quantity, the second was the quality, and the third is now the time span. For those of you who came in a little bit late, at the very beginning, I announced that all of these slides are on my website, kenboa.org, and therefore you do not need to copy these slides at all. You see, they're just, if you just go to resource, the resource box there, in the resource library, you'll see a thing called keynote presentations, and you can get them there. So I'm just trying to make life easier for you. The time span is vis-a-vis the Old Testament concerns, by this I mean, the date of the original authorship relative to our first copy of a manuscript of that. That's the number of years from one to the other. And when we look at the Masoretic text of the Old Testament, our earliest real copy of that is in the 9th century. So you're dealing here with a long time after the original materials were written, since the book of Malachi would have been written approximately 400, 425 BC. We're dealing with a long time range there, time span. However, the Dead Sea Scrolls have had a profound impact on this. I alluded to this earlier. They date from 200 BC to 68. And what they do is they push back the time span by over 1,000 years, effectively, you see. And so they bring us closer in that material to the original than we ever had before. So that's really helped a great deal. And this is a very, as you know, very recent discovery. So that's certainly helped the issue of time span for the Old Testament. As for the New Testament, we have a number of resources. It's exceptional, the time span. There's nothing like it. Manuscripts written on papyrus from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. For example, the John Rylands fragment, P52, has been dated from the Gospel of John from either approximately 117 to 138 AD. This is only within a matter of just a few decades after he would have written his Gospel. Very few decades. And that's really very extraordinary. The Bodmer Papyri, dates from about 175 to 225. And then there's another, the Chester Beatty Papyri, dated from about 250. And the time span for these manuscripts are such that they push us back to within a very short interval in terms of when the autograph was written and our earliest known copy of that manuscript. I might also mention that for the most of the New Testament, the time span consists of approximately 200 years or less, and some books within 100 years of the date of authorship. And that, again, can be sharply contrasted with the average time span of over 1,000 years of other ancient Greek and Latin writings. So it's a very, very different picture. And I'll show you a little chart that is often used along those lines. So when I kind of put this together as far as the bibliographic test is concerned, as I see it, the Old and New Testaments enjoy far greater manuscript attestation in terms of quantity, quality, and time span than any other ancient document. I'm going to be making some conclusions from that a little bit later. This is a chart that has been adapted from various books, but F.F. Bruce has written books on the actual transmission of the text, and others have written on this. When we think about contrast with, for example, Homer, we have more copies of Homer's work than any other ancient material. Herodotus, about a 1,350 year time span. And we're dealing with Plato, about 1,300 years, from about 380 BC to about our earliest manuscript is about 900 AD. So there's a large, and the number of quantities, as you can see, is rather small. For Aristotle's works, any one of them, about 1,400 year time span gap, and a very few number of manuscripts. The same is true of Caesar's Gallic Wars, and also of Tacitus' work as well. Typical time span of about 1,000+ years is what we see in classic Greek, Latin literature. And generally speaking, the number of manuscripts is rather small, in fact, very small. And then when we contrast this with the New Testament, the contrast becomes very evident, because suddenly we're now looking at a time span of about 100 years, actually it's probably over 20,000 manuscripts now, and a high degree of reliability relative to these other works. And so I think this is a very important thing. I will make a statement later on, but I'll say it right now, that there's a double standard going on. And the double standard is this, that people who would be more than willing to embrace the work of Plato and Aristotle without any real questioning about its reliability would balk at the New Testament. And it's quite ironic, because you see, if the standard is so rigorous that you question the reliability of the New Testament documents, bearing in mind that it was not written as a New Testament, but rather these are individual primary documents that were then collected. But if you bear this in mind, what you'd have to do, if you are of that cynical an ilk that you would deny the reliability of the New Testament as primary historical documents based upon these considerations, you would long since have had to abandon your knowledge of the ancient world in terms of any writings that would have come, because they were far inferior in terms of these three components. So I think this is a very illuminating thing that most people do not see. A quick word about the internal issue. We've talked now about the bibliographic, then there's the internal test. That is to say, what does the Bible claiming for itself? And this may appear to be circular reasoning. It sounds like we're using the testimony of the Bible to prove that the Bible is true. But what we're really doing, though, is examining the truth claims of the various authors of the Bible. And then we're allowing them to speak for themselves. Are these 40+ authors of these books, written over a time span, are they consistent in their claims? What does it say about, what do they say? Do they claim to be by eyewitnesses and so forth? And so this is something that I believe is important. And so when we weave this together and look at the other evidences, I think it becomes an important issue of what it claims for itself. For example, John makes this claim, "He who has seen has borne witness, and his witness is true, and he knows that he's telling the truth, so that you also may believe." Or 1 John 1, 1-3, "What was from the beginning, what we have seen with our eyes, what we beheld in our hands handled concerning the word of life, and what we have seen and heard we proclaim to you also." This is not a second-hand account that he's referring to. And Peter, when he said that we didn't follow cleverly devised tales when we made known to you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. So there are these clear claims to having genuine authority and people who actually palpably saw the resurrected Christ and so forth, which was actually a component of being an apostle, having seen the resurrected Lord, having been with him, that sort of a thing. So this is very, very important for us, at least to take that into account, the whole idea of the internal test. As for the New Testament then, there were independent eyewitness accounts of the New Testament on the life, death, and resurrection, which were written by people who were acquainted with him. And these, again, are independent insofar as you can see there's no real evidence of collusion insofar as there are variations in their ways of giving an account for these materials, as one would expect if you have different witnesses of the same, for example, event that takes place from 4 different perspectives. You're going to get some variation, but the basic kernel should be consistent. These authors maintained their testimony, we know, through persecution and martyrdom. And it's very important for us to see as well that if anyone was in a position to know that what they were saying was not true, they would have known. And people may give their lives for something that they believe is true, but they will not willingly give their lives for something that they believe is false. And if anyone was in a position to know it was false, these writers, these people would have been those people. Had they simply denied that Jesus was Lord, had they simply said that we can just deny the resurrected Christ and believe in these other gods and so forth, they would have been able to avert martyrdom. And so we have this very important psychological component as well. The evidence runs contrary to certain critical claims of distortion that the church is the one that invented it and later on kind of put these words into the disciples' mouths and that sort of approach. I'll comment more about that a little bit later. Not enough time for myths also about Christ to be propagated given the time constraints we've just been discussing. And so these are important components relating to the internal test. They were alive when the New Testament was circulated, and there were people who were around then that could easily have, in fact, rejected that material if it was in error. Remember what Paul says. There are some 500 people who actually saw the resurrected Christ, and effectively most of them are still alive. And so there's an invitation to realize that this is something, again, not done in a corner, but something very real. But we move to another, after the bibliographic and after the internal test, you have the external test. And the external test concerns the whole matter of historicity. And because the scriptures do speak of specific historical events, the question is, to what degree are they verifiably externally? And I think this is a very important issue. We're not dealing with a motif long ago and far away, you see, in the idea that it was an imaginary motif, but rather they're really locked into space and time and history, and I think this is one of the important things. I'll give you one example, the prologue to Jeremiah. Note the chronological details. The words of Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, of the priests who were in Anatoth in the land of Benjamin, to whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign. It came also in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the exile of Jerusalem in the 5th month. And we know when those people reigned. We know very much so. I'll give you another example. Luke chapter 3, 1-2. If you study that, he gives a number of locked references and tells us precisely when this occurred. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 2, if you read that, you can actually determine the date of Ezekiel's first vision to God, of God. It was July 31st of 592 BC. and we can actually date that with Babylonian chronology has given us records that can connect, and we know when these kings reigned, and so they're locked into the regency of various people who ruled, and we know when they reigned and what year. If it was this year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, we know when that would have been, and so forth. So there is a tremendous clarity of references to historical details. And indeed, there are secular references as well specific to the New Testament. The historicity of Jesus is well established by early Roman and Greek and Jewish sources. And so there are extra biblical writings that affirm many of the major details, such as Flavius Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, who in fact refers to John the Baptist, he refers to Jesus Christ, he refers to James in that book. And in this work, he also gives us a lot of background details about the Herods, about the Sadducees and the Pharisees, about the high priests like Annas and Caiaphas, and the Roman emperors who are mentioned in the Gospels and Acts. So we have an extra biblical resource. We find other secular references to Jesus, for example, in a letter written a little after 73 by an imprisoned Syrian named Mara bar Serapion, in which he compares the deaths of Socrates, Pythagoras, and Christ. And so it's very interesting that. And other 1st and 2nd century writers include the Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus in his Annals, and also in Suetonius in the lives of the Caesars and in the life of Claudius, and also the Roman governor Pliny the Younger in his epistles, and the Greek satirist Lucian on the death of Peregrine. And Jesus is mentioned as well in the Jewish Talmud on a number of occasions. So it's not as though we don't have other sources, that even if we didn't have the New Testament, we'd know that there was this historical figure who appeared in the scene of history. And so the kinds of acidic doubt that appears where we question whether he was really a historical figure, I think is unwarranted because of not only the reliability of the New Testament as just seen as first-hand or as primary historical documents, but by the extra materials that are also available. Another component of this matter is not just secular references, but archaeological confirmation. I'm not saying that archaeology proves the Bible, but I do think that as we grow in our understanding of the ancient world and gain more information, we begin to see more and more support for the actual reliability. One study Bible, I have a lot of Bibles on my shelves, and one of them is called the Archaeological Study Bible. And it's a fabulous, it's really a good one if you're interested in archaeology, and it really connects archaeological discoveries with specific things that we see. I just want to pull out just a few examples of this. Both the Old and New Testament certainly make abundant references to nations and kings and battles and to cities, to specific mountains, rivers, buildings, treaties, customs, economics, politics, dates, all kinds of things that are specifically alluded to. And I think this is very important for us to see then that many of these details are thereby open to archaeological investigation. And it's important for us as well to see that the kind of higher criticism in the schools of Julius Wellhausen and the documentary hypothesis and some of these things in the 19th century were actually prior to the archaeological explosion that occurred at the end of the 19th century and has continued to the present day, which were based upon certain assumptions that have actually proven to be unwarranted. And so the interesting thing is some of these ideas are still being taught in various seminaries and schools, even though those earlier theories have not really been supported by the evidence. For example, talking about just a few of the books, for the book of Genesis, it's interesting that the excavations in Nuzi and also the Nuzi tablets, the Mari tablets and letters, as well as the Ebla tablets, which were discovered more recently in 1964, and other tablets found at Alalak. These are tablets that have really been very fascinating because they reveal all sorts of things about the Old Testament that are supported. For example, in the Nuzi tablets, We're dealing with the custom of having your eldest servant inherit your wealth, having a servant heir if you were childless. And it illuminates things that we see in the book of Genesis and from that general period of time. The custom of birthright sales, which is also specifically mentioned, as we know, which occurred with Esau and Jacob. The custom of household idols is also specifically mentioned in these tablets. In other words, it fits the actual period that it's claiming to describe. The Mari tablets, the same sort of thing occurs here, where we have mentions of other things like Nahor, which is apparently a city named after Nahor, identified in Genesis 11, a reference to the Habiru people, most likely an Akkadian reference to the Hebrews and so forth, and the Ebla tablets as well, which refer to various components like the various cities of the plain that were destroyed in Genesis. And so forth. So we have a lot of details. Sodom and Gomorrah and other things are mentioned in these tablets. And so that's very helpful. We go to Jeroboam's reign and Solomon's reign. There are a number of things that tell Megiddo that certainly support those, and many, many other sources. We go a little bit later to the period of Omri and Jehu and Hezekiah. And it provides helpful information about this period that's called the divided kingdom. For example, the Moabite stone, which you can find at the Louvre, is a very interesting stone which yields information about the reign of Omri, who's the 6th king of Israel. He's specifically mentioned there in the Moabite stone. Any of you see this in the Louvre? It's fun to see. You have to make sure you go out of your way to see it. The other thing is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser III, and I have seen that as well in the British Museum. Neat to see these things, because there's something about, although I've seen pictures of them, then to see the real thing is somehow, there's almost like a little bit of an epiphany where you see this thing's palpable, it's tangible. I'll never forget, for example, this is parenthetical, when I went to the mummy room in the Cairo Museum, and there you could look right in the face of these mummies, who were, in fact, the pharaohs of the Exodus and the pharaoh of the oppression, and you could look them right in the face. One of them has crow's feet. I mean, you can see their face, and my word, what an eerie experience it was to realize I'm looking right in the face of one to whom Moses said, "Let my people go." Really interesting stuff. And so what we have is a specificity that's connected. We also have the Sennacherib prison, which is at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, or also known as the Taylor prison. And this describes Sennacherib's siege of Jerusalem when Hezekiah was king. And there's a 6-sided prism, is what it is, and written on behalf of Sennacherib, who was king of Assyria, and contains narratives of 8 of his battles. And one of them is one with King Hezekiah, which is described specifically in 2 Kings 19. And that's also quite fascinating. There are also other things, such as the Lachish letters, which refer to Nebuchadnezzar's invasion of Judah and illustrate the life and times of Jeremiah the prophet. We also have specific things concerning the book of Daniel, such as the Nabonidus Chronicle, which is dated from about 555 to 540 BC. And this is interesting because you see, until the 19th century, the knowledge of Babylonia and Assyria was based really on the Old Testament and a few Greek writers. And not until the discovery of these kinds of documents and resources that we have now discovered and deciphered the cuneiform scripts and the languages written in this script. That's when we began to see what was going on, and we learned a great deal. There was, in fact, for example, the Hittites, which are mentioned, you might recall, among the people who inhabited the land. There was a claim that such a people never existed. Now, ironically, you can learn Hittite. You know, enough has been found if you want to really do that, but it's available. A lot of ites who were there, you know, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amalekites, the Phleboites, the electric lights, you know, and so forth. But at any rate, there are a lot of ites. But you also have the Babylonian Chronicle, which tells of King Jehoiakim and Nebuchadnezzar. And these sorts of things I find are very fascinating because one of the objections that you probably will have heard of is that when Belshazzar is mentioned in Daniel 5, the objection had been made that we know that actually it was Nabonidus who was the king at that particular time, and so Daniel must be in error. It turns out then that actually the Nabonidus Chronicle actually shows that he was indeed king of Babylon, but the fact is that we now know that there were 2 kings of Babylon. There was a co-regency. And this was often done, a father and a son. And the father, Nabonidus, installed his son Belshazzar as a co-regent because he was spending much of his time, about 10 years away from Babylon itself, warring against various countries. And so when the Persians conquered the city in 539 BC, Belshazzar was killed. And you recall that then Nabonidus was later captured and they was sent to exile. That would, by the way, explain something we couldn't figure out before. Why on earth would he offer Daniel the third place in the kingdom? Turned out the first two were taken. We just didn't know it. In other words, our knowledge of the ancient world was not understood until this very recent discovery of these chronicles. And so I'm suggesting here that these are actually illuminating our knowledge of the Old Testament in profound ways. The well-known Cyrus cylinder also is important because of the way it describes details about the King Cyrus and what was going on at that time. And I think these are all important things for us to see. We have the Cyrus decree granting permission to the Jews to rebuild their temple. That's mentioned specifically in the Cyrus cylinder. As for the New Testament, a great deal of archaeological support. We have abundant references in the New Testament, as you know, to things like the Pool of Bethesda and Jacob's Well in Bethlehem, Nazareth. Other places, residences of Pilate in Jerusalem, the Gabbatha, the pavement, all these things are mentioned specifically, and indeed these have been actually explored and excavations have been done. Now you can actually see, for example, the pavement. And it's found way under the city, the level of the current city of Jerusalem. And you go down there, and it's really eerie to be there because you can actually see on those stones, which were at one time by the Antonia fortress, they were exposed, they were outside, and you can see carved in them some of the games that the Roman soldiers would play. And so it's right where Jesus was and where they were actually doing this very sort of thing, gambling and so forth, you see. And so you actually can see this thing. And these things are fascinating because they not only make history come alive, but they give you a feel for the reliability and indeed falsifiability of the scriptures. And I think this is a very important issue. Luke is another example. There are many critical attacks that have been reversed, and one of those was Luke as a historian because he made a number of things such as his reference to Lysanias as the so-called tetrarch of Abilene. I can't help but think of Abilene in the Old West. I'm sorry, but the tetrarch, and it was actually assumed that couldn't be true. There was no such person, but archaeologists indeed have found two Greek inscriptions which show that Lysanias was indeed the tetrarch of Abilene in the years 14 to 29. And he uses various technical terms as well, like proconsul and procurator and asiarch and praetor and politarch. And all these are very specific kinds of terms that are actually apropos to the places and people that he discusses. So indeed, actually, Luke turns out to be a very reliable historian in that respect. And so this, again, gives us a greater confidence. And my conclusion concerning this is that it really is unprecedented and unparalleled in passing these three tests, the bibliographic, the internal, and the external tests, in comparison with other ancient books. And that most professional archaeologists and historians really, I find what's interesting, are more likely to acknowledge the historicity of the Bible than many theologians. Many theologians still embrace pre-archaeological critical theories about the Bible. And I think there's more going on to it here that we might suppose. I think the evidence strongly supports the accuracy of the Bible in relation to history and culture, but in many cases it's overlooked or rejected because it may, in fact, go against philosophical presuppositions. I can assure you that if the New Testament documents did not refer to the whole issue of one's eternal destiny, of the issue of God and of salvation and Jesus Christ and so forth, if indeed it was not based upon those things or referring to those things, it would receive a much wider readership and acceptance, let's say, than if it deals with those things. See, what I believe is going on here is often that there is a hard line objection based upon the reality that the scriptures teach that people are at enmity with God, and that there is indeed a hardwired in human nature. A biblical anthropology gives us a very clear and I believe realistic view of what human nature is about. And it shows that in our natural state, we are opposed to the authority and to the rule of God. And that there is more often than merely an intellectual objection, but there can be a moral, a spiritual objection. How many times have I had the experience where I've talked with somebody and I begin to see that they're throwing up smoke screens? And they're just throwing them up because they don't want to deal with these issues. And I have actually told them, if I could somehow prove to you that Jesus really did rise from the dead, and if you could accept that as so, would you then bow the knee and receive him? And they say no. At that juncture, I know now I'm not dealing with a matter of history, a matter of fact, but a matter of the heart. And it really always comes down to this. It's not merely information. There's much more to it than that. The way to God is actually through the way of the surrendered will. And that requires the power and grace of the Spirit of God to break through and that natural blindness. Because as the Scriptures teach, we are in our natural state blinded in this regard. So I should not be surprised if there in fact is a tremendous warfare vis-a-vis these kinds of claims. What I find exciting, however, is that as time goes by, the evidence, I believe, will continue to grow in support. But what I love to see, it's fascinating, I love it and hate it at the same time, is how people just jump on things like the Gospel of Judas. They just, right away, all these crazy, inflated paper, these headlines, idiotic headlines, totally irresponsible, none of which really turned out to be the case. Or this whole idea, we found Jesus' tomb, the family tomb and so forth. All these things turn out, upon further examination, not to be what they're claiming them to be, but people certainly love them because it sells. And people also have a desire, in part, to be relieved by the notion that, see, this stuff isn't so after all. I think a lot of people would, and if you read Dinesh D'Souza's book, for example, What's So Great About Christianity, I like the fact that he has a concluding chapter in which he says at the end of the day, much of the new atheism is wired around the fact that it's a lot more convenient to believe that from the standpoint of one's own moral life. And so there is this factor as well. In other words, we're not dealing merely with an objective thing. There's an objective dimension of truth, I believe. And I think that God has clearly revealed himself in space-time history and has not left himself without witness. In fact, I think that evidence continues to grow. At the same time, however, there's still going to be the capacity that people have to turn away from that. Before I quit, I want to make a couple of extra statements. I believe that God has apportioned the evidence in such a way that there is always enough evidence to satisfy the heart and mind of a person who would receive the truth, but also just enough ambiguity to justify a person's rejection of the truth. And I believe he does this precisely because he so treasures our capacity as people in the image of God to make true decisions and moral decisions that are not coerced. What I find interesting, though, as skepticism increases, so does the evidence, so that he continues to keep up that balance. I do a thing, I have a new presentation I've been working on science, faith, and reason. In fact, I'm going to be trying it out, the visual version for the first time at the National Conference in Christian Apologetics next month in Charlotte. And what I'm approaching is my strategy is to use incontrovertible features of the world. Such, in this case, with the sciences, for example, that the universe has a beginning, that matter, energy, and space and time actually have a beginning, that they're contingent actualities and require something transcendent. Secondly, that there is the growing evidence for the fine-tuning and the incredible elegance of the universe, and this is only going to continue to increase. Number three, the reality of the complexity of the first cell, of any cell, and the yawning gap of the attempts to come up with an explanation for that, and the elegance of vis-a-vis biogenesis, the origin of the first cell. And the fourth one I use is information theory, and I deal specifically with the nature of language and information in the genetic code. And that's all fun. There's a lot of other features of the world, but those four are kind of fun to talk about. And what I find is fun about it is this. I can assure you, as time goes by, that as skepticism increases, God bumps up the ante of the evidence and still makes it so that we can have a satisfied mind. For example, this is not related to this topic, but it popped into my mind, and sometimes I have to give you a little bit of a stream of consciousness here. And in this, I'm thinking about the fact that the claim has been made not many years ago, and still many claim that since it turns out that approximately 98% of the human genome consists of DNA that does not code for genes, therefore the rest must be junk DNA, which is fascinating to me. Consider the arrogance. If we don't know what it does, it must be junk. It's a phenomenal notion. How about a little humility here is what the limitations of science. If anything, you should be aware that the more we learn about anything in the natural world, whatever you want it to be, the more mysterious, elegant, and complex it becomes, not the less. I can predict, and I predicted the first time I heard that that's not going to be true. That in fact, we will discover actual reason for that form of DNA, that 98% has a purpose. It's now been demonstrated, and with increasing clarity, that that's actually an operating system that guides the actual gene expression from the other portions of the DNA, and that there is another more hierarchy of operating systems, one above that that guides that operating system. If anything, it's getting more elegant, not less. And the deficient attempts to refute this are becoming more anemic. They're becoming less and less satisfying. But what's interesting is the weight of the evidence continues, and this is ironic. With greater capacity and technological prowess, we're beginning to see more and more evidences for the Creator all around us, even though skepticism increases. This is why I believe the new atheism is more and more shrill. Shrill because the evidence is systematically moving away from them. As to fine-tuning, I can predict with tremendous confidence that every year more fine-tuning parameters will be discovered. Indeed, they are. In the time when Sagan wrote his book Contact, there were only a couple of these that were known. Now there are over 600 of them, and growing fine-tuning parameters. I won't go any further than that. Let me see. That's my conclusion. A double standard. And so I would say, by the way, this is just another little thought before we go and finish this. A word about the fact that if we can show at least that Scripture, without claiming inspiration, this is very important. My approach is merely to say, are these in fact credible primary historical documents, these individual documents? Because if we can show that they are reasonable, that provides a fine case for the resurrection of Christ, because of what we can deal with that, because actually attempts to explain away the resurrection of Christ, given this reality, become actually more implausible than that he really rose from the dead. They take a good deal more faith to believe. And ultimately, the resurrection of Jesus, by the way, would then point to the divine authority of Scripture. Why? Because Jesus bears witness to it, and if he indeed rose from the dead, then what he says about the Scriptures probably has a little bit of weight. You see the logic here. So I'm not starting with inspiration to support inspiration. I'm simply starting with this as reliable documents, then showing that it would then point to the resurrection of Christ, which then moves us to a conclusion about what our Lord said. So if that makes sense. I think I'm going to stop there.